Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal interesting facts on Monday, August 4, 2015. First, Willow never expected the darkness of her past to resurface so violently, but Drew's discovery shattered the fragile illusion she had so carefully constructed. He unearthed the secret she had buried with Sasha's departure, the disturbing truth that she had manipulated and monitored Daisy Gilmore, the child of Brendan and Evelyn Beamford, under the guise of concern. Her obsession with seeing her children, particularly Wiley and Amelia, had driven her to cross lines she once vowed never to approach. She had pressured Sasha to leave Port Charles, silencing a potential threat and wrapping her actions in a false narrative of healing. But now, Drew held all the cards, and instead of exposing her immediately, he chose a more insidious route, blackmail masked as reconciliation. He didn't need to raise his voice or threaten her directly. His silence spoke volumes. Every time Drew looked at Willow, there was a quiet menace behind his eyes, a reminder that he knew the truth and that her freedom depended entirely on his mercy. He started dictating the terms of her life, where she could go, who she could see, how she should behave around their children. It became a prison without walls, and Willow's world shrank under the weight of invisible chains. What terrified her most was that Drew still wore the mask of the wounded partner trying to rebuild their family, even as he manipulated her every move. It took time, but the crushing guilt and the mounting fear pushed Willow to break her silence. She turned to Michael, the only person who once truly saw the best in her. In a moment of raw vulnerability, she confessed everything, how she had stalked Daisy, coerced Sasha, and orchestrated lies just to get closer to Wiley and Amelia. Michael was shocked and angry, his faith in her shaken by the extent of her deception. But beneath that fury was a painful recognition. He, too, had contributed to her spiral by cutting her off from their children. His punishment had become her madness, and now they were both complicit in the fallout. But Willow's confession wasn't only about atonement, it was a declaration of war. She had made a decision that would alter the course of everything. She would take Drew down. If he could play with secrets, so could she. No longer the timid woman begging for forgiveness, she became calculating, composed, and driven by something fiercer than guilt, righteous revenge. She began collecting information, quietly tracking Drew's business activities and pinpointing irregularities he thought were well hidden. She started whispering doubts in the ears of his allies, painting him not as a hero but as a manipulator, a man who used personal leverage for professional gain. She learned to weaponize perception. People still saw Willow as gentle, well-intentioned, maybe even a little broken, but harmless. That illusion gave her cover to move undetected. She leaked just enough information to make Drew look unstable without pointing fingers. She planted the seeds, and soon, his empire began to crack from within. Board members hesitated, friends distanced themselves, and Drew, once so confident in his control, began to question everyone around him. He sensed something was wrong, but never suspected Willow. That was her greatest strength, the underestimation of a woman who had once been broken. Willow's transformation was complete the moment she realized she no longer feared Drew. What began as desperation had evolved into defiance. She had been stripped of her dignity, her motherhood, her sense of self, but now she was reclaiming it all on her own terms. The war she waged wasn't loud or violent, it was slow, methodical, and devastating. And when the final blow came, when Drew stood alone with everything crumbling beneath him, Willow wouldn't look back. She didn't want his forgiveness. She didn't want an apology. She wanted him to understand what it meant to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone else's silence. And in that moment, she would finally be free. Second, Jen Sidwell had never been a man to operate openly, and this time, his plans were darker, more intricate, and far more dangerous than anything he had attempted before. Behind the veil of civility and business dealings, Sidwell carefully constructed a web of vengeance aimed squarely at Sonny. He believed Sonny's reign in Port Charles had lasted too long and was rooted in corruption, power games, and emotional manipulation. But Sidwell didn't act alone. His secret weapon was Marco Rios, a man who had once known restraint, compassion, and purpose, but who now was transforming into something cold, relentless, and terrifyingly efficient. Marco had given his heart to Sidwell's cause, and as he slipped deeper into Sidwell's orbit, he began executing covert moves designed to destabilize Sonny from within, never caring about the collateral damage it might cause. Marco was all in, fueled by years of frustration watching Sonny avoid consequences and manipulate those around him. His loyalty to Sidwell wasn't just strategic, it was emotional. He had come to see Sidwell not just as an ally, but as a father figure who offered him purpose and direction in a world that had left him feeling invisible. With Sidwell's encouragement, Marco began embedding himself in places of influence, gathering intel, forging temporary alliances, and pushing boundaries that once would have given him pause. His eyes were fixed on one goal, bringing Sonny to his knees. What he failed to see was how thoroughly Sidwell was using him. Every move Marco made fed into a larger plan that only Sidwell truly understood, one in which Marco was more pawn than partner. Lucas Jones sensed the shift almost immediately. He'd spent enough time with Marco to recognize when something inside him had changed. The warmth, the grounded moral compass, the glimpses of vulnerability, all had been replaced by a calculated distance and quiet aggression. It wasn't just that Marco was hiding something, it was that he had stopped caring whether Lucas noticed. When Lucas finally discovered that Marco was working directly with his estranged father, Jen Sidwell, to take down Sonny, the revelation sent shockwaves through his heart. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was a collision of everything he feared, Marco being consumed by vengeance and his father pulling the strings behind the scenes. Lucas pleaded with Marco to stop, to walk away before it went too far, but his words fell on ears that no longer heard reason. Marco's response was colder than Lucas had expected. He didn't deny the plan. He didn't even try to justify it. Instead, he spoke with the conviction of someone who believed he was doing what needed to be done, even if it meant destroying the man he once loved. He accused Lucas of being blind to Sonny's corruption, of standing idly by while others suffered under Sonny's influence. Marco's pain had morphed into moral certainty, and that certainty had no room for empathy. The conversation fractured something irrevocable between them. Lucas saw in Marco not a man standing up for justice, but a man losing himself in a cause that could never truly offer redemption. And Marco saw Lucas as a liability, someone who might jeopardize everything. Meanwhile, Sidwell watched from the shadows, satisfied by how easily Marco had been redirected. It had always been his strategy to isolate Marco, to strip away his emotional connections so that he could mold him completely. Lucas's disapproval served Sidwell's purpose perfectly, it deepened Marco's dependence, made him feel righteous and justified. Sidwell didn't care about Marco's future or his safety. He only cared that Marco carried out his vision for Sonny's downfall. And if Marco fell in the process, Sidwell would simply find another pawn. He'd already begun planting evidence and sowing misinformation, letting Marco believe he was at the helm when in reality, Sidwell had been the architect of every move. Lucas now stood in a tormenting moral limbo. He could not support Marco's plan, not when it meant allying with Sidwell and possibly putting lives in danger. But stopping Marco would mean betraying someone he had once given his heart to. Worse, it would mean going against his own father, again. As the threat against Sonny intensified, Lucas realized he had no good choices left. The man he loved was gone, replaced by someone twisted by vengeance. The father he once admired had become a shadowy tyrant pulling strings behind closed doors. And Lucas, caught in the crossfire, had to choose whether to protect the city, protect Marco, or destroy the legacy of both men. Whatever he chose, he knew there would be no escaping the consequences. Third, Jason had spent weeks haunted by memories of Britt and the growing sense that something about her disappearance didn't sit right. Among the fog of grief and confusion, one detail kept surfacing in his mind, a travel bag she used to carry, stitched with a small, elegant symbol of 5 red poppies. It had once seemed trivial, just a decorative flourish, but now it gnawed at him like a forgotten code waiting to be cracked. When he cross-referenced the symbol with black market travel logs and covert resort identifiers, he uncovered a remote hideaway in Dubrovnik known for housing those who wanted to vanish. The deeper he dug, the more clear it became, this wasn't just a luxury retreat, it was a sanctuary for those running from something, or worse, those being hidden on someone else's terms. Jason knew immediately that he had to go, that this place could be the key to unlocking the truth about Britt. The resort in Dubrovnik wasn't on any map, but Jason had learned long ago how to find what others tried to bury. He arrived under an alias, bypassing the usual security through bribery and sharp instinct. From the moment he stepped foot inside, the atmosphere felt wrong, too still, too perfect, too scripted. Every staff member seemed rehearsed, every answer rehearsed and vague. And then, through the blur of guests and Mediterranean sunlight, he saw her. Britt. Her hair slightly longer, her posture serene, her face composed, but unmistakably her. Jason froze as their eyes met. For a moment, he saw a flicker of something, recognition, confusion, fear, but it vanished instantly. Britt turned without a word and disappeared through a private corridor, leaving Jason stunned in the courtyard, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and horror. Jason tried to follow her, but the staff blocked his path with subtle but firm resistance. No one admitted to knowing her, no room was registered under her name, and the corridor she entered was locked with biometric security. It was clear she wasn't just staying at the resort, she was being kept. The more Jason investigated, the clearer the picture became. This was no ordinary retreat. It was a facility quietly tied to Professor Hank Dalton, a disgraced cognitive scientist whose work on memory manipulation and identity suppression had been condemned by nearly every ethical board in Europe. Britt had previously reviewed and rejected Dalton's research as dangerous and unethical, calling it a violation of human autonomy. And yet now, she was one of his test subjects, proof that Dalton had not only continued his work in secret but had made Britt its centerpiece. Dalton's fingerprints were everywhere. Jason found traces of altered medical records, name changes, and neural signature files under aliases. Britt had not just been hidden, she had been rewritten. Her memories of Jason, of Port Charles, of her life before the resort had been suppressed through a combination of pharmaceutical therapy and cognitive conditioning. What Jason had seen in her eyes that first day wasn't recognition, it was the shiver of a fragmented memory trying to breach the surface. Dalton had tried to erase Jason from her mind, but it hadn't worked completely. Every time Jason drew near, Britt's behavior changed, she paused, her eyes lingered, her expression clouded. The real Britt was still in there, locked beneath layers of artificial calm and obedience. Jason became increasingly desperate. He began hacking into restricted terminals, stealing keycards, and uncovering encrypted files with the help of a trusted WSB contact. He discovered that Britt's cognitive programming was showing signs of instability. Dalton's methods, while advanced, weren't infallible. Britt's subconscious had begun rejecting the overwrite, resulting in memory bleed and spontaneous emotional surges. Dalton, recognizing the danger, had scheduled a full neural reset within the week, a procedure that would destroy any chance of recovery. Jason knew he had only days left to act, or Britt would be lost to him forever. He formulated a plan, one that would require complete infiltration of the medical wing, distraction of the core security team, and a risky extraction under full surveillance. The night before he was set to move, Jason stood on the rooftop of the resort, looking down at the garden where he'd first seen her. The red poppies swayed in the wind, just as they had in that memory she once shared with him. She had told him once that poppies were her mother's favorite, a symbol of fleeting beauty and lingering pain. That memory, too, had likely been scrubbed clean. But Jason believed in the strength of what they had. He believed that love, once deeply rooted, could survive even the cruelest manipulations. And he would prove it, not just by rescuing Britt from the facility, but by helping her reclaim the pieces of herself that still lingered beneath the surface. He wasn't just going to find her. He was going to bring her back. Finally, now that Molly Lansing Davis had pushed Cody away, driven by the wedge Christina so subtly yet deliberately created, the emotional terrain shifted dramatically for everyone involved. Molly had tried to suppress her growing affection for Cody, rationalizing it with logic, law, and long-held ideals about stability and restraint. But her heart had strayed despite herself, finding unexpected warmth in Cody's chaotic charm. She had begun to envision a future that deviated from the one she had meticulously planned, a future that included Cody. Just as she was beginning to lean into the possibility of something real and raw, she found herself blindsided by a truth she hadn't anticipated. Cody had begun spending time with Ava, and worse, something more than casual interest seemed to spark between them. Cody, emotionally wounded by Molly's withdrawal, didn't entirely realize how deeply she had been affected by Christina's manipulations. All he knew was that the closeness he had started to build with Molly had been abruptly severed, and every attempt to understand the reasons behind her distance had been met with cold avoidance. In the loneliness that followed, Cody found solace in Ava. There was something magnetic about her edge, her unapologetic strength, and the vulnerability she buried beneath perfectly curated confidence. Unlike Molly, Ava didn't ask him to be anything more than what he already was. She saw the bruises beneath the bravado and didn't flinch. That small, unspoken understanding was enough to draw him in, and the more time he spent with her, the more he wondered whether he'd been chasing something impossible with Molly all along. But for Molly, discovering Cody's closeness with Ava was like a dagger through her carefully concealed hope. She had almost reached out to him, almost told him everything, that she regretted pushing him away, that she still felt something undeniable pulling her toward him. But now, watching Cody with Ava, laughing, relaxed, attentive, it felt like betrayal, even if she had no right to claim it as such. The pain curdled into resentment, not toward Cody, but toward Christina. Molly began replaying every conversation she had with her sister, realizing how subtly Christina had planted doubts, how carefully she had twisted Molly's insecurities to suit her own agenda. Christina's words had seemed supportive at the time, but now they echoed with manipulation. That realization ignited something in Molly, a fury she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about love or jealousy. It was about control, about being robbed of her own decisions under the guise of sisterly concern. She confronted her feelings with the precision of a woman trained in truth and justice, but there was no courtroom for this betrayal, no legal precedent to undo emotional sabotage. All she could do was watch as Cody drifted further into Ava's world and further away from the future she had briefly envisioned. That sting of lost opportunity, mingled with the awareness that Christina had orchestrated it, left Molly simmering with a quiet, growing rage. Cody, unaware of the full emotional fallout, found himself torn. While Ava offered excitement and something dangerously easy, there was a part of him that still looked for Molly in every quiet moment. He sensed there was more to her distance than she ever admitted, but with no confirmation, he continued to move forward, one step deeper into Ava's gravitational pull. His affection for Ava began to evolve, no longer just a distraction but something real, something complex. Yet he couldn't fully silence the ghost of Molly's unfinished words and unexplored confessions. It haunted him in small ways, a glance, a familiar turn of phrase, an empty seat where he wished she would be. As the tangled emotional threads continued to pull tighter, what began as a misunderstanding had become a full-fledged emotional battleground. Molly blamed Christina, Christina pretended innocence, and Cody stood unknowingly at the heart of the storm. Ava, meanwhile, played her cards carefully, fully aware of the impact her presence might be having but unwilling to walk away from something that finally felt alive. In this web of damaged trust, missed chances, and bruised pride, none of them could see where it would all lead, but they all knew it was far from over. In the wake of fractured bonds and quiet betrayals, the consequences of every withheld truth and misguided choice began to settle like ash across their lives. Molly, once so certain of her own restraint, found herself tormented not just by what she had lost, but by how easily it had been taken from her, manipulated by a sister she once trusted implicitly. Her anger toward Christina only deepened as she witnessed the blossoming connection between Cody and Ava, not through malice, but through a shared vulnerability that Molly had denied herself the right to express. She now lived with the realization that love, when ignored out of fear, doesn't wait patiently in the shadows, it slips away into other arms, other stories, and sometimes, it doesn't come back. Christina, for her part, remained unaware of just how deep her influence had cut. What she saw as protection, keeping Molly away from someone she viewed as reckless, had instead cost Molly a piece of herself. In her need to control the situation, Christina had underestimated her sister's emotional capacity and overestimated her own wisdom. But that mistake, cloaked in good intentions, left damage that couldn't easily be undone. Whether out of guilt or defiance, Christina retreated into silence, perhaps sensing that some lines, once crossed, leave a mark not only on relationships but on identity itself. Cody stood caught between two women. One who stirred a storm inside him and left him longing for something he couldn't name, and one who offered him calm in the eye of emotional chaos. His feelings for Molly hadn't vanished, but they were now shrouded in confusion and resignation. With Ava, there was fire, understanding, and a bond forged not from shared dreams but shared survival.